All right. Um, so, welcome everybody to an engaging night of discussion here, brought to you by the George Washington Students Against Imperialism. We're incredibly excited for tonight's panel. The Students Against Imperialism are an organization dedicated to anti-imperialism and anti-capitalist agitation and education and aid on campus at George Washington, as well as in the greater DC area. And tonight's panel, it's on a question that is ostensibly simple, but has great ramifications for all of us. And that question is America moving towards a new Cold War against China? And with us, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Daniel Bessner. Daniel Bessner is a historian at the University of Washington, where he currently holds the Joseph Anauer Honors Professorship in Western Civilization. His area of expertise is the intellectual history of US foreign policy. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine. As well, we have Tobita Chow. Tobita Chow is the founding director of Justice is Global, a special project of People's Action to build a just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. He is also a leading progressive strategist regarding the US-China relationship and the rise of xenophobia in the United States. And finally with us, we have Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is a historian, journalist, and author of 30 books, including Washington Bullets, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. He is the director of the Tricontinental Institute, chief correspondent for Globetrotter, a columnist for Frontline, and the chief editor of Leftward Books. And so, yeah, I would like to once again thank all our panelists. I'm very excited, and I'll turn things over to Hajra.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. So before we begin, I'm going to explain the structure of tonight's event. We're going to have each of the panelists answer some questions that we've curated in whichever order or in whichever sequence you guys choose to answer them in. And feel free to elaborate on each other's responses and just go from there. And we want to remind all attendees that the Q&A feature is open throughout the duration of the event. So if at any time you have any questions, please drop that in the Q&A section. And after an hour, we will open up questions and I'll read them aloud to the panelists. So with that, let's begin. So the first question that we have for the panelists tonight is, what is the state of US-China relations? Are we moving towards a new Cold War?
Hajira, I think you're going to have to point a finger at somebody because this is not going to work like this, to be honest. Zoom is so bizarre that nobody's going to speak then.
Okay, in that case, Vijay, let's start with you.
Okay, let's do that then. But please do this in future. Like, look at them. Three of us would have sat here for like an hour just going, after you, after you, after you, because we're such polite people and we don't believe in war. You see, that's our problem. We are too polite. Nobody's aggressive. Okay. Well, look, don't ask me if there's a Cold War. Ask Antony Blinken. He lives near you, in fact, somewhere in Washington, D.C., and I think you're there. So you should drive over to his house and go with my friend Brian Becker, who introduced me to you and said there is this webinar, and off you go and ask Mr. Blinken, is there a Cold War, Mr. Blinken? Why, Antony, if I can call you Antony, why did you talk so rudely in Anchorage, Alaska? It's the first time you're officially meeting a high-level Chinese delegation. Two senior members of the Chinese government are sitting across from you, and you start to lecture them about, the world order. I mean, let me pause for a minute, friends. Today is the 46th anniversary of the United States removal from Vietnam. The United States was defeated by the Vietnamese people after using chemical weapons, illegal chemical weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, on Vietnam. I've seen those fields between what used to be North and South Vietnam. Nothing can grow there for generations. Now let's talk about the rules-based order and how the international community must behave. United States went to war in Iraq, a completely illegal war. I didn't say that. Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, told BBC that in 2004. He called it an illegal war. That wasn't the Chinese government that prosecuted that war. It was the US government that prosecuted that war. United States government has prosecuted so many wars, tried to overthrow so many people, blah, 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 blah. Yet Blinken goes to that meeting and arrogantly lectures the Chinese delegation about the rules-based orders, wags his finger, says this is how you have to behave. I mean, you got to understand that Chinese officials and a large section of the population has a vivid memory of 19th century humiliations, of the indemnities of the two opium wars, including the seizure of Chinese territory. They understand and remember like yesterday. I mean, I've talked to officials. They talk about the Marco Polo Bridge incident, how the Japanese behaved in China, and so on. Mr. Blinken was a throwback to a US, British imperialist, honestly. Like Chris Patton lecturing the Chinese today about Hong Kong. I mean, you were the last administrator of Hong Kong under British dominion. Why didn't you give democracy to the people of Hong Kong? For 100 years, all you did was so-called guided democracy. Now they lecture China. Is there a Cold War? There's at least bad behavior. And then bad behavior coupled with a lot of money spent by the United States to garrison the Pacific Ocean and threaten the Chinese with freedom of navigation, ships going into very close to, if not crossing into Chinese waters and things like that. Is there a Cold War? Look at the way they behave. They have contempt for humanity.
Daniel and Tobita, do you have anything you would like to add?
Tobita, why don't you go and I'll go last? That's fine with me.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So I think so I try to avoid the term new Cold War now. Part of that is just like rhetorical strategy. I'm concerned that the use of the phrase will encourage a sense of fatalism about US-China conflict that I want to avoid. So that's just like about rhetorical strategy. I think like the question is difficult to answer because what does new Cold War even mean? The analogy with the original Cold War is tricky because there are some similarities, but also super important differences. On top, the chief of which is maybe the deep integration of the US and Chinese economies, which is very different from the situation in the old Cold War. But yeah, setting that aside, I think the state of the US-China relationship is, it's on a long-term trend towards deterioration and escalating conflict and is very dangerous. It is the greatest source right now of like threats of global instability, the risk of military violence, and also the greatest source of obstacles to the global cooperation and global solidarity that we need to meet any of the real problems that we face here in the US and globally, like right now, the pandemic, like climate change, like global poverty. It's just overall like a really bad and toxic scene. Another difficulty with the phrase new Cold War is that everyone in the Biden administration and almost everyone in the foreign policy establishment will say that, oh, absolutely not. We don't want a new Cold War. Like that's the last thing that we want, right? So it's like, well, let's actually define what it is that we're talking about and what is the status quo approach from the foreign policy establishment towards China. So they prefer not to talk about, they say, no, we don't want new Cold War. They will often say that they don't want US-China conflict. They will say that like, well, the reality is that we're in strategic competition. So that's sort of like the dominant term right now, strategic competition. But But I think like when you look at what strategic competition means to the foreign policy establishment, and one way to get a sense of this is to look at this bill that was introduced by Senator Menendez, who's a Democrat, the Strategic Competition Act, which tries to spell out what US-China strategic competition is going to mean for US foreign policy. When you look at how the US-China relationship is understood there, basically the understanding is that China presents a sinister threat to democracy everywhere in the world, including the US. China is in effect like a threat to the US way of life. Because of that, the approach is basically one of containment. There is this idea of a zero-sum competition between the US and China, that any gains for China's economy are automatically a loss for the United States, and that therefore the only path forward for the United States is to undercut China to prevent the continued growth of the Chinese economy and undermine Chinese economic development. So do you call that a new Cold War? I don't care what we call it. I think, there's questions. Again, rhetorically, we can make strategic decisions about what the right terminology is to use publicly, but it's very bad. It commits the United States to a path of escalating conflict with China. And if we have the two top economies in the world on a path of escalating conflict, that just spells disaster for the world. And is inevitably going to translate into really toxic consequences domestically within US politics. This is terrain that favors the right. It favors the most dangerous elements of the right. It favors white nationalists. It favors militarists. Just bad news all around.
So I agree with everything that my co-panelists said. I'd just like to maybe take a step back and think historically and structurally. I think what Tobita said is really critical. One of the major realities of the first Cold War, the OG Cold War, was that the United States and Soviet Union really didn't have much economic interaction. It's hard to overstate that. Very little for the majority of the Cold War, a little bit at certain moments through proxies in Europe and elsewhere, but really not much interaction. There's a totally different material reality for US-China relations. The two economies are so embedded with each other and have been so imbricated with each other for so long, you're just not able, in my opinion, to structurally get the same type of saber-rattling Cold War that you were able to get during the original one. It's just not feasible. So then I'd like to think about, what does the new Cold War really signify? So there are some structural realities. The United States is the global hegemon. Everyone knows that the statistics, it has 750 military bases, et cetera, and a lot of those bases ring to China. And then there's the issue of Taiwan. So what I see happening is that China is a regional power, which without putting a moral bent on this, because I don't want to in any way be viewed as claiming anything about the CCP, which is done a variety of things of which I don't approve, but just thinking from a great power perspective, it quote unquote makes sense that China would want to dominate its region for a variety of cultural, historical, practical, material reasons, just like the United States, again, something I very much don't agree with, but the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere and has for over 100 years, well over 100 years. And I think China seeks something similar in its own region. However, I do not think China seeks the type of global, and never does, and as far as we can see in the future, doesn't, I don't think really will, seek the type of global hegemony that the United States has sought and has achieved. Personally, I think that type of global hegemony is ultimately a cultural thing that emerges from American Puritanism and American Protestantism, which is this very universalistic philosophy, which is global, genuinely global in scope, and I don't see any sort of similar cultural things operating within China, at least on a global scale. I would also say the same is true for Russia. So then what do you have? You basically have a situation where the United States has a bunch of regional allies in East Asia throughout the region, has a ring of bases throughout the region, supports many of the region's armies, and China doesn't want that to happen. And I personally also don't think that the United States is going to fight a war over any of those powers, and certainly not over Taiwan, in my opinion. So you have this situation that is similar to, sort of like the mystification of geopolitics, where the United States, I think when people think about it, they understand the United States isn't going to be forever dominant, literally able to be forever dominant in East Asia. It's just not possible for a variety of reasons. And I think you're going to witness a slow retreat. The question is, how does that retreat, what is the context of that retreat? Does it happen, China one day crosses the Rubicon of the Taiwan Straits and actually invade Taiwan, or does it happen in some sort of negotiated security position? So to me, that is the real geopolitical question. The question of the new Cold War, though, in my opinion, relates mostly to domestic issues about building up essentially manufacturing consent for the continuation of the American empire, and manufacturing consent for essentially the military budget, which serves as basically slush fund to a lot of Congress people in both political parties. So what I just wanted to do there was to sort of make the clear intellectual demarcation between what I see as geopolitical realities and the domestic purpose of new Cold War rhetoric. And I don't know enough about the domestic situation in China, but my understanding is that it is also useful for the CCP, and Xi in particular, to promote a new Cold War with the United States as a way to engender domestic support for an increasingly illegitimate communist party, especially as inequality proceeds inequality continues to grow in China. And one more thing, and then I'll stop. China is also faced with the problem that its growing middle class demands consumption. And this is a problem that China just had. Like, the Chinese middle class, as it continues to grow, just cannot consume like the American middle class has consumed for 75 years without absolutely destroying the world. We've already destroyed the world on our own. Now imagine to triple or quadruple the population. It's just not feasible. So there's a climate issue here that I think is going to become more and more salient as the years go on.
Could I just say something about Daniel's statement about the Communist Party in China and its, to his mind, increasing illegitimacy, or whatever he said? Because last year I read with great interest Harvard University's report, which I commend to you, Daniel. Harvard University has since 2003 taken upon itself to measure the Chinese public's opinions on a range of things, including on the Communist Party. It's a really interesting report because it looks like they don't have a legitimacy problem, at least according to Harvard University, one. Secondly, I travel to China a lot, and I talk to a range of people. And it's one of the interesting things I find in US foreign policy is the United States understands that it's not going to be easy for the US government to conduct some sort of harebrained regime change, that they tried and failed in Syria even. Fail in Syria, you're certainly not going to succeed in Beijing. It's not going to happen. And they've been looking since the 1990s for a Gorbachev, and they just can't find one. There simply isn't a Gorbachev who's willing to go the Soviet route for China. So I actually think that things are a lot more complicated, Daniel, than what you're saying. There are, of course, contests. There's 1.4 billion people. The Chinese people are not robots. The Chinese people have a range of opinions, but there's a very large membership in the Communist Party. I don't know how easy it is to say that it's totally legitimate, not legitimate. So I would caution people from making general statements like that. China has its own political traditions. It has a very complicated set of social and political and economic dynamics. So I generally don't run with caricatures. And I would neither say it's legitimate or illegitimate. I would say that it has a very complex situation. There are memberships of that party. There are people who don't like it. Many years ago, we brought Chen Enfu, who was a senior scholar at the Chinese Social Science Academy, to give a lecture in Kerala. He gave a fantastic lecture in which he talked about the 8 different schools of thought in China. He talked about Jeffersonian liberals. He talked about neo-Marxists, creative Marxists, nostalgic Maoists. He laid out, he said there's American-style neoliberals. He said there's that. Fascinating lecture. there's a range of opinions. And when we asked him, Mr. Chen and Fu, what's the ideological position in the Communist Party? And he said, well, I just laid it out for you. The Communist Party has almost as many opinions as Chinese society because it's such a large party. So, I mean, I just want to say that, it's okay. You can have. Once again, let me just finish, Daniel. You can say whatever you want, but I want to just say that I think in the service of being somewhat measured about how different people think differently, let's not caricature a country with 1.4 billion people and a very large political organization.
Sure, I don't think I was doing that. I think I was responding to recent events taken by the Chinese Communist Party, which seem to reflect an increasing angst about what the general population thinks about that. Obviously, things are complex. There's a bunch of different ideas going on. It's an enormously complex country with different regions. But I didn't mean to imply that there was a binary yes or no for Chinese communism. Of course, there isn't. But I would ask then, what do you think is responsible for things like Xi making himself leader for essentially life and things along those lines, and the increasing cracking down on large Chinese business leaders and things along those lines? What do you think's happening there?
I mean, you're talking about Jack Ma, so let's be precise if that's what you're talking about. And I don't think Xi is making himself leader for life. I mean, the Chinese just went through a process in the Communist Party. He's got a position there. But look, this is not an Oriental despotism. I mean, again, even within the Communist Party, let me just finish, please. I didn't say he's a leader for life. I'm just trying to respond to that because that to me sounds bizarre. Like, I don't think he's a leader for life. I think that in China, like in many countries, like in the post-October Revolution Soviet Union, these countries that made a revolution were all extraordinarily poor countries. None of the advanced industrial countries made a revolution, whether it's China or it's Vietnam or it's the Russian Empire, which was very poor at the time, low levels of industrialization and so on, or it's Cuba in '59. They had a complicated task. They had to do something which most industrial countries, if they had had a revolution, wouldn't have had to do. On the one side, they had to increase the productive capacity of the country, because when you talk to Chinese leaders, as you see a range of them, not only from Deng onwards, not only from the 78 reform, but earlier, you'll find that people said we can't create socialism out of poverty. That's what Pol Pot and company were doing. That's objectionable. You have to lift people up from poverty, but to do that, you have to increase the productive capacity. You increase the productive capacity, you also have to socialize the gains, and you're going to take a big risk, because as you increase the productive capacity, you're going to create inequality. You're going to create the Jack Ma. So you have to zig and zag. And that's what we see since at least 1992. We see a lot of zigzagging happening, whether it's Hu Jintao coming in, going in this direction, then you see Xi, and Xi has tried to push in a sharp direction away from inequality. He's the one who drove the anti-poverty campaign and so on. So, I mean, this is a debate inside the Communist Party. How far is too far and so on. In some ways, they're trying to bring Jack Ma a peg down. Jack Ma started making statements, political statements, starting to criticize this, that, and the other. They brought him down. That's what they did, because they have political control over sections of the economy. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, that's a separate issue. But it's very plainly clear that there's a lot of zigzagging that's been happening in the last 20 years. People who say China is this or China is that, well, it's actually a process. It's a set of experiments. And they're struggling. Look, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty, okay? If I had to choose between being born in India and being born in China, I was born in India, I would pick China if I was a poor person. 700 million Indians go to bed now hungry every day. And in China, they don't anymore. China, when the revolution took place in '49, was one of the poorest countries in the world. Now it's not. So, I mean, we got to look at these things in terms of, comparisons. Is Mr. Modi the bloody leader for life in India? I'm tempted to say he's trying his best to do that. But it's also complicated in India. You can't do that, even though he tries to present himself in some godlike way. So what I would like to say is that it's a very complicated business building whatever they're building, socialism, a modern society, a rational society, a society without poverty. It's a very complicated journey. And I just don't think that, we have too many models of a very poor country trying to lift itself up so fast from such a wretched position. We just don't have a comparison. That's part of our problem. You can't compare China, let's say, to the United States, or you can't compare China to Germany. This is not a good comparison because these countries didn't face that semi-colonial status of China. It didn't face, China was in a war from 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge, till 1949. The Americans make all these films about World War II. The United States was in World War II from 1941, December. So really 1942 to 1945, mid-year. So that's 42, 43, for 3.5 years at war. China had a World War II of 12 years, guys, 12 years, in the middle of which Chiang Kai-shek decided to bomb a dam and flood some of the most productive parts of China. I mean, that's how the country was ruined in 1949. So you got to have an historical perspective. You got to look at these things historically. I see a lot of Twitter kind of conversations going on, people eager to jockey for some kind of position. It's too facile. You got to look deeper than that.
Thank you.
No, I just would like to very quickly respond. I just wanted to say I totally agree. And as a historian, I totally agree that it's important to adopt a historical perspective. And everything that you said, I agree with. This is a gigantic issue. I was just speaking to the fact that it does seem to me that the Chinese leadership is worried about its increasing legitimacy, and everything that a lot of things that I have read, at least on China, seem to suggest that. I'm not trying to make a value judgment or about the difficulty of the project to which you're referring, though I would say I do think that a democratic aspect is important, and I do think the abolition of presidential terms, which she did in 2018, that does seem to me indicate something, even with the difficulty of the project and the historical understanding that I agree is absolutely necessary.
Can I weigh in here? And I also want to get back to the US-China conflict question. Knowing some of what Daniel and Vijay think about this could go on for a long time, and I'm worried about a quagmire here. So I think Daniel is right that the ruling class in China is anxious about its hold on power, and that this is just very similar to the ruling class all around the world. Like, elites everywhere are feeling a lot of anxiety. And this has to do, I think, fundamentally with just systemic contradictions in the global system that have been growing over the past decade and a little more than that. At the same time, what we've seen, particularly since the last year, is, and Vijay mentioned this, like, by all measures, it seems that the party has ample support at the popular level and among elites. And that actually, so I agree with Daniel, like, I have a lot of critiques of the Chinese government and sort of see this as a problem. But so getting back to the US-China conflict, the US-China conflict has, in a way, been a great boon for Xi Jinping and for the Chinese Communist Party, being able to frame Chinese politics in terms of escalating conflict with the US and what they see, I think some very often accurately, is aggression from the United States, has helped to really inflame nationalist sentiments in China, which translates into increasing support for the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a dynamic here, which we also see in the United States, where increasing US-China tensions translates into anti-China nationalism here in the United States, which then builds that kind of political support domestically in the United States. So I think we can see sort of parallel processes here and like a connection between these international tensions and sentiment within domestic politics.
So going off that, who benefits from a Cold War on China? Daniel or Vijay, either of you can pick this question up. Daniel first, I guess.
Well, I think I'll speak to the United States, which is my area of specialty. I think who benefits from it is the military-industrial complex and the military-intellectual complex. People whose basically the structures that have been established since 1945 in order to promote the American empire and its bases and the money spent. I think this is a transpartisan issue, an issue that crosses parties. It allows both Congress people in both parties who have pork in particular districts to gesture toward the new Cold War in order to basically increase defense expenditures. I think it benefits people in the think tank complex around Washington, D.C. If there's no American empire, they don't have a job and they need another justification. And so I essentially see on some level the new Cold War just being the latest in a long string of enemies constructed by the United States, from the Soviet Union to, in the 1990s, genocide, broadly speaking, to quote unquote Islamic terrorism after 9/11, and now to China. And there needs to be a logic in order to justify these types of expenditures. But I also think, and this is what really scares me, and this actually where I think it could reflect the Cold War, is that one of the great things that the Cold War did, great ironically, is that it essentially allowed vaguely social democratic policies to be justified through a logic of national security. And the one that I always point to is the National Defense and Education Act, I believe of 1958, which was basically the first time the American government really spent an enormous amount on research, not in wartime, and it was all justified through Sputnik. And so what I'm worried about is that the new Cold War becoming a logic of American life, a logic of American governance, much like the first Cold War was, where we justify everything from public housing to welfare programs to increase education and research funding with reference to the new Cold War. So I think that the issue is that in a world where most Americans don't suffer the consequences of their empire, it's very easy to demonize China, to establish a new Cold War, because a lot of people benefit. And I see this happening right now across the political spectrum. There's been a wide embrace of the new Cold War, I think, for these very reasons. It benefits both elites and then people who could essentially get money from the U.S. government by claiming essentially to be contributing to national security.
Totally agree with that, Daniel. And I'm happy to see that you're a fan of Butthole Surfers, one of the great bands. What's that album? 1980s, powerful, psychic, Another Man's Sack. That's, yeah, great band. Just to add to this, who benefits from the war? Definitely not the people of the planet, guys. Definitely not the people of the planet. Underline that. Definitely not the people of Afghanistan, where there's this fraudulent withdrawal going to start tomorrow. They are not going to benefit from this Cold War, because a lot of this stuff that's going on in Central Asia is a lot of jockeying by these various powers. And I mean, whoever benefits, it's a small minority. The people in the United States are actually, Daniel is right. There will be some social democratic policies probably pushed through because of the war, but I hope people don't see the wages of war as a good thing. The wages of war are shameful, and people need to resist this. We need a world of cooperation, conciliation, discussion, dialogue. There are things we need to advance. Climate is a thing we need to advance, global inequality, rights of peoples. We need to advance these things. We can't advance it in a mood of confrontation, hypersonic cruise missiles, God knows what all else they're up to, information war. You're not going to solve these things. And by the way, anybody who's worried about whatever's happening in Xinjiang, I can tell you, this kind of all information war business, it doesn't help the people in Xinjiang. The more you have people yelling and screaming genocide, the less it's going to help people in Xinjiang. If you think you're only helping yourself, it's making you feel morally superior to I don't know who. But this is not the way to build, confidence and improve people's lives. This just puts people at two different positions, and then they're not going to budge. So I'm totally opposed to this kind of thing. There are problems in all kinds of places in the world. People need to back off a little bit, not believe that they are sanctimoniously the truth on everything. Every American politician that points fingers and says, look at that in Xinjiang, people should recognize that per capita, the United States is still the largest incarcerator in the planet Earth. is still the largest incarcerator on the planet Earth. We talk about genocide, you point fingers at Gaddafi, point fingers at Saddam. United States is responsible for over 1 million deaths in Iraq because of an illegal war prosecuted after 2003. Over 1 million people dead. I mean, you can't start a conversation about rights by saying that I stand in purity and you are imperfect. It just doesn't advance. We need to collaborate on these issues, not take such hard positions.
So going off of what Vijay spoke briefly about the situation in Afghanistan, should this Cold War or deteriorating relations between the United States and China develop to their fullest extent, what consequences would this have specifically on the global South?
I'd like to speak to that. I'm very concerned about this. It is already very clear and has been clear that the United States government and the foreign policy establishment looks at the countries of the global South as pawns in this US-China great game, and as disposable pawns in that game. I remember seeing a quote by some member of the foreign policy establishment talking about how, now we're seeing, it's about intelligence, that intelligence, the intelligence community is now increasingly looking at the whole world through the lens of the strategic competition with China. And then the analogy they use is like we did with Angola in the Cold War, which is complete madness, because looking at Angola through the lens of the Cold War led to the US helping to foment a murderous civil war that lasted for decades in Angola. There's another piece by, it was in, I think it was Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs. It was by a couple of retired military leaders and someone who's doing a PhD in whatever degree these like national security people take. And it was talking about great power competition is coming to Africa. And there was a part where they said like, well, no one likes proxy wars, but realistically, we need to prepare for a new age of proxy wars in Africa. And so like, this is what is coming. A growing swath of the global South is being trapped in between this US-China conflict. And just as we saw in the old Cold War, it is going to be highly destructive. It could lead to proxy wars. It is going to undermine efforts for economic development, efforts to lift people out of poverty. The US, like I mentioned before, this bill by Senator Menendez, the Strategic Competition Act, one of the provisions is that in that act is to greatly increase funding for this thing called the Inter-American Development Bank, which provides financing for projects in Latin America from the US. Okay, fine. But attached to that increased funding is what are called conditionality clauses, which mean that any Latin American country that accepts this increased funding from the United States to do what are hopefully some very important things in those Latin American countries must commit not to, afterward that, take out any loans from China. So they're being forced to choose, if I accept some funding for what is hopefully this money doesn't just go to militarization, right? Maybe that happens, but hopefully it goes to something that actually meets human needs. Like if a Latin American government accepts that funding from the US, then after that, we're like, oh, we need to build a hospital or a highway or something, and China's offering that financing. We can't do that anymore because we've already made this commitment to the United States. So this is really toxic stuff that is going to lead to very difficult trade-offs and dilemmas for global South countries. And one other piece of this is going to be, we are going to see the United States putting its support behind authoritarian and nationalist governments in the global South if they're willing to ally with the US against China. I think we're already seeing this with India. We could see it in the Philippines. And again, this is very familiar from the old Cold War. And all of that, again, is going to be done in the name of democracy and freedom and human rights.
Could I actually just bring up a topic that I'd love to hear my co-panelists what their opinions are? Would that be okay? Okay, so I mean I agree with everything, but then the issue that comes up to me, and I'm just very curious what you think, is that at least this is GW, so it's an American institution. I'm writing in the United States, and one of the issues that comes up to me, because I agree with everything that was said about the United States being the world's worst incarcerator and all of these issues, but in a country where the left is incredibly weak and also has no influence on foreign policy, I was just wondering what my co-panelists think that the left should do as a strategic matter, because again, while I agree with these moral positions, I'm not sure it's a winning electoral or coalition building issue to stress the evils of the United States as much as I might agree that these are historically true. So what is a left who is actually seeking to win power and use the levers of the United States, which, like it or not, is the imperial hegemon, to do in terms of building coalition, in terms of building support for a left-wing foreign policy in the absence of a transnational working class revolution that I don't personally think is on the table? It's a genuine question. How do you relate to power if you actually just don't want to be on the outside looking in, as the American left has been for at least 100 years?
I mean, Daniel, how does one even answer a question of that scale? Entire political programs are developed around this. I mean, I don't want to give a full answer, Daniel, but I feel like this is a protracted struggle, to borrow from the old man. And I think the American left might want to consider a long-term strategy and not get caught up every 4 years, every 2 years in an electoral debate, in a debate around electoral politics. There needs to be a long-term strategy, long-term discussion about some of these issues. Let me come back to the point that Tobita raised, which I think is very important. In El Salvador, I reported a story. There is, on the Pacific coastline, there is a part of El Salvador where China wanted to build a port. In fact, it was partly Chinese non-state capital that was coming in. The president of El Salvador went to Beijing. It was great. They signed some things. Chinese money was going to come in and so on. Then the next president went to China, had a conversation. On the way back, stopped off in Japan. Shinzo Abe told him, you got to cut this deal. He basically carried the bucket for the US government. The US government had developed a program called American Creche, CRECHE. And the idea is that the American government was going to assemble private funding to undermine any attempt by Chinese capital to enter into Latin America. It's the Monroe Doctrine on steroids. And El Salvador under pressure, and actually he said he was afraid of what he was hearing. It was like a mafia hustle. They pulled out of the China deal and it took some money from, and then the US government, and by the way, this program, American Creche, was run by Jared Kushner's college roommate. He flew to El Salvador, to San Salvador, and they signed an agreement for this tiny amount of American money. Same in Ecuador. Lenin Moreno's government essentially took money from the United States to buy out the Chinese debt. What Chinese debt? Here's the interesting thing. China had made loans to the government of Rafael Correa. During the pandemic, the various state banks and the private companies had told the Ecuadorian government, you don't have to do any debt servicing, and we're going to give you a holiday on these loans for maybe 2-3 years. So there was no debt trap involved here. In fact, in the Atlantic magazine, you can read a story about the so-called debt trap diplomacy. It's a very good story. But anyway, the Ecuadorian government, despite the fact that China was not extorting on the debt during the pandemic, they accepted the United States position, took US money, which is actually an outrageously usurious loan, took US money and paid the Chinese back. So this hustle that Tobita has warned against is very, very serious, that countries are being asked to choose whether it is, in terms of 5G technology. And look, everybody seems to suggest, people who know tech, that Huawei produces as good, if not better, tools and cheaper tools. And yet countries are told you can't use Huawei. And interestingly, and here there is no parallel. Interestingly, I have not seen the Chinese government insist on only use Chinese, don't use American money. The test of this is Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro, his son is a total anti-China racist. He's actually a xenophobe racist guy. The Chinese government hasn't stopped investing and doing deals with the Bolsonaro government, because what China says is, we'll deal with anybody. You want to deal with Americans, go ahead, but also deal with us. It's actually, in this particular case, the US government that's imposing a litmus test. You can only deal with the US government, can't deal with China. So it's not actually a parallel, mirror image, both sides doing the same thing. In this particular case of undermining development projects in the global south, it's a one-way street. And I think that people in the United States should make a little noise about this, because this stuff is happening in the name of US citizens. And I think it's, just wait till the penny drops in places like Zambia, where right now there's a presidential election, and Fred Mumembe, who's running from the left in that election campaign, is going to make an issue of the fact that the US ambassador is telling them you can't do deals with China, but you can do deals with Swiss companies and Canadian companies who have terms that they impose on the Zambian government of Mr. Lugo, which are much harsher than the terms that the Chinese companies are putting forward. I mean, these are commercial deals. China is not in Zambia out of some socialist internationalism. They are not saying they are. They are in a commercial deal. But the US embassy essentially tells Lugo you can't deal with them. And that is something people need to think about. You can't buy into this whole BS, China's taking over the world. Chinese colonialism, I had a conversation with a Belgian journalist about this, who's talking to me about Chinese colonialism in Africa. And I was like, you have to be kidding. You have to be joking. You guys have not even come close to apologizing to what you did in the Congo, assassinating Patrice Lumumba 1961, taking his remains and keeping them in a museum. Barbaric, behavior by the Belgian government. And now you're complaining about China. Give me a break.
But the issue, I don't disagree, but the issue is that Americans don't care, and the United States has created a structure to insulate them from the consequences of imperialism, most dramatically with the all-volunteer force, but in the entire structure. So to me, I mean, I agree we should do it, but they don't, and I don't see why they would. And to me, this is the gigantic problem facing the American left. Americans already don't care about foreign policy, and I don't see a way to do that by any sort of moralistic claim about what is right or what is not. It just doesn't work historically. It just hasn't worked historically. I mean, the fact is the left is not effective in terms of its foreign policy critique in this country at all.
So I have some thoughts about this. In terms of we're, and this is, I think, part of maybe what you're getting at, Daniel. We've been stuck for a long time in a position where we're just on defense and fighting off the bad stuff that the foreign policy establishment is throwing at us, and doing so with very mixed results in terms of effectiveness. And I mean, really, the recent gains of the campaign to stop US support for the war on Yemen is maybe a real bright spot in the past 2 decades. And that's just super recent. What we really need is a positive vision of foreign policy, and that's been lacking. What are we fighting for? And I think what this ultimately gets us to questions of the systemic problems in the entire global economy, and what's the progressive way forward on that. So I don't have time to get into all of that, but this is something that we are thinking about at Justice is Global. And when it comes to countering the US-China conflict, I think the way forward on that is to emphasize the need for international cooperation on shared global challenges. So in particular, US-China cooperation, but that needs to be part of a bigger puzzle. We need more of that around the pandemic. We also need much more of that around climate change. The US and China need to work together on climate change. When I listened to Biden's speech the other day, and it was all framed around the US winning the 21st century. It's well, no, that is not the task. We need humanity to survive the 21st century. And these are in contradiction with each other. If the US is trying to win the 21st century, none of us is going to survive it. I think, and this is also, we look at polls, and this is a place where we actually see a lot of popular support for international cooperation, including with China around these shared challenges like climate change, like the pandemic. It's very obvious that these are things where the whole world needs to come together. There's also a question here of like, how does the left build the grassroots power needed in order to fight for these proposals effectively and win them? And I think that's a real question. Like, this basically comes down to a question of self-interest. Like, where do we find the people with a clear sense of their personal stake in countering like US imperialism in these ways? And a big part of like our theory of change is like, let's start by looking at members of the global South diasporas here in the United States. The US we're here in the imperial core. One of the flip sides of the imperial core is that the world comes to you. So much of the world, so much of the global South that is suffering from the exploitation and oppression in this US-led global system is here. So let's start by organizing power there and then build off of that. And I think this is we're in an opportunity like right now to actually put that into practice with just the horrifying way that the pandemic is currently playing out in India. Indian Americans and other members of South Asian diasporas here in the US are pissed. And there is an opportunity here to build some grassroots power starting in South Asian diasporas to pressure the United States to stop its current path of supporting and reinforcing vaccine apartheid globally. So like that's like a very concrete starting point.
Thank you to all our panelists. We're going to enter into the question and answer portion of tonight's event now. I'm going to pass it over to Julian, another Students Against Imperialism member, to take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I would just like to say that I have greatly enjoyed the panel, and I think you all have had amazing things to say. So we have one question here that came earlier that is about how does anti-China rhetoric, deteriorating relations with China, how does all that impact Asian Americans?
Badly. Yeah, I mean, this has escalated in particular since last year with coronavirus, the coronavirus pandemic, and all the narratives that Trump led, but they were also bipartisan, in particular in the early stages, using China as a scapegoat for the pandemic. But there's longer standing trends, but I want to like get away from that because that gets a lot of attention, right? But there's more to it than that. So I want to name concretely some anti-Asian racist narratives that we know have shown up in cases of harassment or even violence, right? So one is associating Asians with the pandemic in different ways, right? Another set of narratives, though, is people have been harassed on suspicion of being Chinese spies or agents of the Chinese Communist Party just because they're Chinese or are just Asian and kind of look Chinese. I've been a target of this myself. And we can tie that very closely to narratives from the foreign policy establishment warning about that there's this threat of Chinese espionage or there's this narrative of like Chinese influence campaigns that very poorly defined, and that inevitably raises the specter of people from China acting on behalf of the Chinese government in sinister ways here in the United States. That feeds racism. This is, again, like, this is familiar from the Cold War as well. Another key narrative, very popular in both parties, of US-China economic competition and portraying China as an economic threat to the United States, and the idea that prosperity in China means poverty and suffering for people in the US. That inevitably feeds into into narratives like, you're taking our jobs and you are the reason why we are out of work, which is, if you know your Asian American history, notoriously that was the narrative that helped get Vincent Chin murdered in 1982 outside of Detroit. A Chinese American man was murdered. At the time, Japan was the supposed economic threat to the United States, and that led to the murder of a Chinese American man outside of Detroit, accused of like stealing American jobs. So those are I think some very concrete ways that we can see these anti-China narratives feeding into racism. And I mean, as someone of Chinese descent, every time a political leader mentions the word China, I just cringe, because I'm like, yeah, like I like inevitably, I know that I'm going to end up getting implicated in that.
All right, well, if our other panelists don't have anything to add on, we can move on to another question. We have here a question that is asking, a couple of questions really that have asked basically, like, how can, we people on the left, people who understand, the crimes of the United States, and like, how can we address human rights abroad, if we can at all, without, enabling and legitimating interventionist violence or other such things?
From my perspective, the best way to address human rights abroad would be for the United States to get rid of its empire. I think one of the things that Americans are going to have to accommodate themselves to in the coming decades is not being in the driver's seat of history, or at least perceiving themselves to be in the driver's seat of history. This is a cultural transformation that occurred over the course of the 20th century, where Americans consistently feel the need to ask themselves what to do, or they feel the need to do something. And I think that's a really big problem, and that I think if one looks at the Cold War, and I'm particularly influenced by a book called The Cold War's Killing Fields by, I believe his name is Paul Chamberlain. It just shows how these sorts of do-gooder aspects of our foreign policy are usually ill thought out. They have blowback consequences that cannot be predicted, and they often fail. Nevertheless, there are instances where it does seem like the global community should, quote unquote, get together to stop a human rights violation. However, we live in such a structure where that's always the global north at the top of that decision-making apparatus, which in some sense makes it a fundamentally illegitimate project. Which is all to say that when I am asked this question, I always respond, the best thing to do is to get rid of the empire. And then we could talk about building more genuinely democratic global alternatives to dealing with what are really conceived of as crimes against humanity. The problem is who's deciding what the crimes are, et cetera, et cetera. It's always been the global north from the beginning, and that's a significant problem.
Completely agree. And I want to say, just so that people understand what human rights are, I think human rights as a concept is often deeply weaponized. Look, every year, this is Indian government data, okay? I mean, I'm talking about India a lot, I'm sorry. It's my location, and that's what I think about. Indian government data shows every year 10 million people die of hunger. Can you just write that down? 10 million people die of hunger every year. This is a human rights violation. It's a human rights violation because in India, there's no lack of food. This is not a Malthusian problem. You might want to go and look up Malthus. A nonsensical argument doesn't make, because we have enough food in India. It's just that 10 million people die of hunger every year because they don't have money. And they don't have money, and there's no social welfare food delivery system because India follows very strict International Monetary Fund prescriptions, which have been prescribed to the world with the help of economists who teach in US institutions and with the help of the US Treasury Department. Now, I am not prepared to take lessons from the US government about human rights as long as this same government, not just this government, but the governments that have sat in those chairs, continue to pressure countries like India not to have any social welfare programs, not to have food delivery programs or ration systems where we can give people grain and so on. So, people will get worked up about, 100,000 people dead here. Oh my God, what's happening in Libya? 300 people have been killed in Ashtabia or in Sirte or whatever. That's an atrocity, no doubt. But you want a human rights violation, open saw happens in plain daylight? You're comparing 300 people killed in one place and you say, well, that's a crime of commission. In India, it's a crime of omission, 10 million. It's not a crime of omission. It's not an accidental death. These are structured killings of 10 million people a year because they can't eat. And they can't eat because policy does not allow them to eat. So I would like people to just expand a little bit their idea of human rights. One of the things that these outfits have done, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, is they've so narrowed the concept of human rights, so narrowed the concept that they are unwilling to look at this kind of crime scene. They're not willing to look at this crime scene. And you don't want to look at this crime scene, that's up to you. But then don't expect that the world will listen to you lecture about human rights. Don't expect that the world will listen to you lecture about human rights.
I think something that's very important for the left, and also just important for effectively raising human rights concerns, is that human rights criticisms need to be sharply decoupled from the whole idea of US-China competition. As things stand, it's very clear and increasingly explicit that human rights criticisms of China are just like an instrument in the hands of anti-China hawks. I mean, that's not everyone who raises these concerns, but that's a lot of people, and that's how it tends to function. And I think that's very destructive from a human rights perspective. It undermines the effectiveness of human rights advocacy coming from the US if it's quite obvious that this is just a tool in the toolkit of trying to contain China. Even under the best of circumstances, our ability to affect domestic policy within China is quite limited from the US. But whatever potential there is there, it is severely undermined when it is clear to people in China, particularly political leaders, that this is just a tool of strategic competition, right? It's like, so does that mean that if we improve conditions in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, then the United States government is going to stop trying to undermine the Chinese economy? No, that's very clear. There's no reason why any leader in China would think that, right? It also undermines, I don't know what significance the moral force of these appeals have, but when it is just transparently cynical, that moral force is just disappears. I think specifically with respect to Xinjiang, there is a lot to say there. I think that if the US government were to do, and again, I also am very skeptical of relying on the US government to improve these things. But if the US government were to advocate effectively on this, I think what that would have to look like, that would have to involve, is a very clear rejection of the whole approach of the war on terror, accountability for all the crimes that took place under the heading of the war on terror, and a clear recognition that the crackdowns on Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnicities was itself closely connected with the US-led war on terror. In China, the name for those policies is the People's War on Terror, and it has been explicitly joined to the global war on terror, which was led by the United States. And does can the United States say that that whole approach of the war on terror was a mistake, that it was monstrous, there's multiple crimes against humanity, and that terrorism is a real problem, but the U.S. is going to lead on a humane approach that doesn't rely on invasion and bombing and murder and torture and detention. The U.S. cannot come to China right now and make that case, right? Like absent that, it just like human rights advocacy around Xinjiang, I think faces like real heavy obstacles in terms of effectively changing behavior on the part of the Chinese government.
Right. Okay. We have another question here. I know we already touched a little bit on the pandemic and stuff, but there's a question asking about the vaccines, and especially now we have the whole issue of the vaccine waiver and vaccine availability in other countries. So I guess just what is the role of the deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China on vaccine distribution and vice versa?
I mean, what does the questioner want us to say? What do you have here? You have North Atlantic countries, Canada, the United States, hoarding vaccines. You have the US government putting in place the Defense Production Act, which is preventing raw materials for vaccines to be imported into India, which is now the epicenter. It's been going back and forth, India, Brazil, United States, three of them epicenters of. The Defense Production Act enforcement by the Biden administration is a callous disregard for the public around the world. Canada has 5 vaccines per head. They seriously need them. What's going on with Justin Trudeau? I mean, meanwhile, look, the Chinese are delivering vaccines around the world, including to India, despite the whole, Tobita, whatever we call it, Cold War, medium war, lukewarm war, whatever the hell we call it. Middle of all that, the Chinese are sending vaccines everywhere. They're sending medical personnel to Palestine to train people. I mean, Daniel, to the earlier point, what can the American left do? I think American politics may not be the driver in this. I think that people around the world are going to scratch their heads in this period and say, here's the interesting thing. In the middle of this pandemic, you were vaccine hoarding. The Chinese were delivering vaccines to us. There were Chinese doctors in Morocco. There were Chinese doctors in Zambia. There were Chinese doctors all over. And Chinese medical internationalism is really interesting. It doesn't come from the central government. Something I learned accidentally on a train in Morocco. Every province picks places in the world where they send brigades of doctors. So I think the Morocco, they came from Jilin, I think. It's the state or provincial government that sends people on internationalist missions. This is long before the pandemic. The Chinese have a medical internationalist tradition like the Cuban doctors, who, by the way, you should go to cubanobel.org and sign the petition for the Cuban doctors to get the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's a good year for them to win it. But I mean, around the world, very soon people are just going to see that it's right in front of you. There's a Sinovac, and that's a public sector vaccine. The Chinese vaccine, the Russian vaccine, the Cuban vaccine, these are public sector vaccines. Meanwhile, you don't have a US vac. You have, Merck, you have Moderna, you have Pfizer, you have Johnson & Johnson, private corporations who are using public funds to pandemic profiteer on the sale of the vaccines. I mean, the US left needs to wake up, I agree. But people around the world are not waiting for the US left, to lead wherever we are going. People want a multipolar world. We'd like the United States to go back a little bit to its own navel and look a little bit and see what's happening in the country. Okay, I think Trump was a lunatic, but my God, in his opening speech, when he came to office, when he used that phrase, American carnage, I don't think it's inappropriate. There are vast areas of the United States, industries have collapsed, people don't have good jobs and so on. I mean, don't go and build bases abroad. Build some infrastructure in the United States, for God's sake. Build some bridges and things that you need to build. Why you keep going and building bases in Diego Garcia, where you're continuing to displace the Chagosian people? You're building these bases in Guam. The people of Guam don't necessarily want the United States there. Okinawa has voted over and over again for the US to leave. The US is right now expanding their base in Okinawa. I had written about how the Obama administration helped overthrow the government of Hatoyama in 2009 because he won the election in Japan on the mandate to close down the base in Okinawa. Hillary Clinton played hardball against the Hatoyama government. Obama, when he was in Japan, refused to have a state dinner with Hatoyama because he was against the base in Okinawa. Hillary Clinton went there, they destabilized that government. I mean, if we had proper news reporting, we'd call it what it was. It was essentially a legislative coup. Hatoyama had to leave office. The right came back into power. That's something the US government did because you don't want to leave the base in Okinawa. Why are you expanding the base there? Build some public housing so you don't have homelessness all over the place in Los Angeles. The last time I was in Los Angeles, I was horrified to see the level of homelessness. Why are you building so many bases? Build public housing in Los Angeles. People around the world are saying, what is this civilization that the United States has at home, and what is it exporting? What is it exporting? There are Cuban doctors, and as Fidel Castro said, there are US bombs. Cuba exports doctors, the United States export bombs. Is that the way that people from the United States wants to see themselves? And it's not a moral critique. This is not a moral, I'm not making a moral critique. I'm just asking people, what do you want? Do you want to be the exporter of weapons? Or do you want to be the people collaborating with other countries to tackle the pandemic, to provide health, to provide, what do you want as young people? You are all Julian, Hajira, you are all young people. What do you want of your country? You need to ask of yourselves that. You need to talk to your peers. What kind of country do I want to live in? Do I want to live in one of the world's largest arms exporters? Or do I want to live in a country that believes in medical internationalism? Julian, this is a question for you, man. This is not a question for me to figure out. I'm 54 years old. I'm at the other end of life. It's for you to figure this out.
I think, though, Vijay, one of the problems, though, is that what the actual existing power relationships in this country is that the empire is insulated from any form of democratic responsibility. The public has no say what happens in it. Congress barely has a say what happens in it. Moreover, everything that the empire does has been insulated because who fights our wars? It's volunteers and private contractors. So this is I don't think consciousness raising is going to do it. I don't think that everyone in the world could be against the US empire. And I don't think it matters because the US empire is so much more powerful than every other state on earth. It's not even close. It's the first truly global empire, and it's the first state in human history that could literally destroy anywhere on earth in the blink of an eye. Moreover, the imperial apparatus is not connected at all to the democratic will. So this is the question that I really meant to be asking. It's not a matter necessarily, as I see it, of like Americans deciding. Americans could decide today that we want to do nothing but redistribute all of our money to the rest of the world. But that's not really the issue facing us. And I think that is the major problem. I think the left critique of US foreign policy has been the same for decades. And it's a criticism that I agree with. It's obvious. It's our views from a moral perspective and a historical perspective. But to me, it's a question of strategy more than anything else. And consciousness, I mean, as a Marxist, everyone could, maybe everyone in the globe would become conscious of itself and then lead the path to revolution. But I have my doubts. And I don't see a path to actually taking on the US war machine. I don't see a path. China could send all the doctors at once. Cuba could send all the doctors at once. Only one country spends almost $800 billion on its military. Only one country has 750 military bases. And only one country has an enormous amount of nuclear weapons that are able to be taken down. So then what does one do in that situation? That to me is the most interesting question possible. And it's one I don't have an answer. And it's the one that the next generation is going to try to figure out. And the only way I see us, I mean, maybe I'm too pessimistic. The only path that I think forward is an electoral one. The U.S. power of foreign policy is not only concentrated in the executive branch, it's concentrated literally in the White House. There's several hundred people who make these decisions, and the rest goes on inertial. So I guess I would say I think electoralism is the only way forward, and I think we're nowhere near achieving an electoral victory for the American left.
I want to get back to the vaccine question. I mean, the U.S. is a huge global villain when it comes to COVID vaccine access. I mean, maybe I want to talk about like, if global society were operating in any reasonable way, like what is the response that we would see? I think what we would see is like from day one, all scientists and researchers getting together to research the virus and research vaccines and treatments and share all of their results freely. And then we would see all the countries of the world pooling their resources to figure out how do we produce as many vaccines as we need to in order to vaccinate the entire population as quickly as possible. Do we need to build more vaccine factories? Great, let's do that. Let's build these vaccine factories all around the world and share the vaccine technology freely so that everyone can be building all this stuff at once. And instead, what we have seen is the whole approach to the vaccines has been nationalistic, and the US is a major villain in supporting this and imposing a form of vaccine apartheid on the world. And in particular, like right now, there's a fight around lifting the patents on COVID vaccines. This has been proposed by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization. Almost the entire Global South supports it. I think with the sole exception of Brazil, every Global South country that is a member of the World Trade Organization has voiced its support for this measure. And it's being opposed by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by European governments, by Japan, which is a very familiar set of villains when it comes to sort of these sorts of international justice questions. I think that's sort of the primary fight right now. Like that's not, if we win that, that's not going to solve all the problems, but that's a major one right now. And the US is the major villain there. I'll say that, you know, as far as China goes, China supports that proposal at the World Trade Organization. So good on China. But I do have questions. I don't actually know here, but is like China sharing its vaccine technology freely? Like I feel like China could decide that its vaccine technology could be shared freely with the world, even without this World Trade Organization decision. And I don't actually think that's happening, but I'm not totally sure.
So this is a really important question. And it's not only China, but also the Cuban vaccine. There are conversations about how this can happen. One of the things, Tobita, which I've been looking at, or at least my institute has been looking at, is the patent waiver question is very important, but the production capacity question is equally important. Like many countries just don't have pharmaceutical production capacity, particularly not public sector capacity. Because if, say, China says you can take the formula for Sinovac, which is, by the way, already available. It's not like, these things are already available out there. They put them all online in order to say, look, we've been testing it and so on. Anyway, the point is that the issue comes down to the fact of how to produce them. And here is the question is, it still seems that some raw materials are not available in enough scale. And by the way, I just want to put this, I have to leave in a little bit, but I wanted to put this on the table. Bill Clinton and Bill Gates have come out in opposition to the vaccine patent waiver. Bill Clinton should not be listened to on any of this, because I don't know which year it was, maybe you'll remember better, 96 or something, when the Monica Lewinsky thing was hotting up in Washington, D.C., Bill Clinton authorized the bombing of Sudan and of Afghanistan. And his cruise missiles were to strike a so-called chemical weapons factory in Khartoum, Sudan. They struck that factory. It was the Al-Shifa factory. No chemical weapons were made there, but it was the Al Shifa pharmaceutical factory, the only pharmaceutical production unit in Sudan. And today, Sudan has no pharmaceutical production units. The US government destroyed it, never rebuilt it, even though later government said there's nothing terrorist in it. It was a pharmaceutical company. The Al Shifa factory, you could at the time look online and you could see that it said it was Al Shifa pharmaceutical. Now, I know you can put any signboard and you can make anthrax in there. I know, I'm not naive, but the fact is, even the government said it was pharma. They destroyed it. I mean, and that was an obvious dramatic thing. Bill Clinton, why is he taken seriously on this issue? I don't know. Tony Blair, nobody should listen to them. But the issue I want to raise here is it's also production lines. India can produce 60% of the world's vaccines as it does. But India is not going to break the WTO on this. It's waiting for the waiver. It's waiting politely in the queue. Don't ask me why, but India is waiting in the queue. I think these countries should just break the law, and then see what the cost will be. That's what I would say. But India won't. India is waiting in the queue. And other countries that have said that they would just make it can't make it because they don't have production capacity. And that's the heartbreaking thing right now. Oxygen is the easiest thing. You just take the nitrogen out. Hospitals in the advanced industrial country make their own medical oxygen. In India, you don't have that capacity. Why, in such a highly industrial country, do Indian hospitals not have the capacity to make oxygen? Because they're private hospitals. They didn't bother to invest in their own hospital. They import oxygen from factories, and it comes not in any other way than on trucks. And if there's traffic jams, as there often are, the trucks are not getting to the cities. People are dying because there's no medical oxygen. That's what's happening in Delhi now. There are queues to get beds, to get oxygen. And so it's far from the question of vaccine. You can't even produce oxygen. What vaccines, So you asked a very good question. Why aren't people just doing it? Because they can't actually. And even though these vaccines are available, the Cubans are quite ready, to put this out there. There's also an interesting thing. Years ago, I interviewed Iranian officials and said, look, you have all these rupees sitting in India. Why don't you buy your grains from India? Do you know where Iran buys its grain from even till today? Does anybody know? It buys it from the United States. So I asked these officials, why don't you buy rice and wheat from India? India has a surplus producer. And they said, no, the quality is better from the US. I just want you to recognize that countries will say, well, we'd prefer the Pfizer vaccine than the Cuban vaccine. I mean, we have a long journey ahead of us, guys. Let's not jump ahead. We have a long journey. We have a lot of work to do to get people to understand that just because it comes with a brand name, doesn't mean it's better. This is a consequence of a generation plus of neoliberal cultural domination. This feeling that brands are better than public sector goods. It's going to take a long time to get through this. I have to leave in a few minutes. I'm sorry, but I just want to hear you. You were going to say something. Sorry.
So I have one other point about this. So the pharmaceutical industry has been lobbying heavily against this waiver of vaccine patents. And I agree with Vijay, like this does not solve all the problems. It is like one thing that needs to happen, but there are lots of other problems that we need to solve when it comes to scaling up vaccine production distribution. But when it comes to this issue of the vaccine patents, previously the pharma lobby had been moving this argument about like, well, breaking this patent won't matter anyways, because these global south countries, they're too incompetent to make these vaccines anyways, right? So there's in effect a racist argument. More recently, they've adopted a different argument, which is contradictory to that argument, which is like, if we share this technology with the world, then we're going to run into a problem because it's going to get into the hands of China and Russia. And then they're going to start to fix all kinds of diseases. And they might start healing more diseases than we do here in America. So that's the new talking point from the pharma lobby that a number of members of Congress, including some Democrats, then picked up. That is clearly grotesque and absurd. But they're running with that argument because I think they know that it is going to work in Congress. And it is just like one example of how US corporations have like mobilized around using this narrative of US-China conflict and competition in order to protect their own profits and their own power. Like just a series of different forms of the argument that like, you need to make sure that we make as much money as possible. We need to protect our corporate power, otherwise China will win.
I'm going to leave now, but I just want to say that what he just said is so correct. The Financial Times, not, socialist worker or anything, the Financial Times ran a story about this, quoted pharmaceutical industry people. This is what they're telling the White House. This is what they're telling the US trade representative. The headline of the story is vaccine makers say IP waiver could hand technology to China and Russia. So this is not made up by Tobita. This is not some, left-wing conspiracy. This is in the Financial Times. They're quite proud to let the world know that they have these oddball ideas. You think my ideas are oddball? You should go and read these industry experts. Boy, they have some wacky ideas. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm really sorry I have to go. It's May Day in Delhi. We have a very long program that starts quite early. It's program events about the farmers starting 4 p.m. India time, which I think is 6 a.m. US Eastern time. So if you want to join us, it's at Leftward Books, Mayday Bookshop, Facebook, etc. See you guys. Happy May Day. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Hajira. Happy May Day.
All right. On that note, in general, I would like to thank our panelists, I guess, who are still remaining. Thank you so much, the both of you. It has really been incredible to just hear all of you and what you have to say. And I'm sure that all of our attendees equally enjoyed. For our so also I just want to shout out for our attendees here. Students Against Imperialism is going to be having a summer reading and study group where we're going to be going into some of the political economy of imperialism. We're going to be doing Lenin's imperialism and then Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism. So for all of those who are attending the panel currently, be on the lookout on the Psy Instagram page and all of that, and you will hopefully be able to join us for that. But again, not to draw away from our wonderful panelists, it's really so amazing to have you all here. Thank you.
Thank you.